Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into a chilling true story that began as a normal transcontinental flight, a flight filled with laughter, families, and the quiet hum of jet engines slicing through calm skies. But at 35,000 feet, normal vanished in an instant. What followed was a nightmare of courage, chaos, and unthinkable terror, a battle fought not in a war zone, but inside a passenger aircraft thousands of miles above the ground. It began on a bright morning, the kind where the sky seemed endless and blue, as Flight 417 prepared for takeoff from the city's bustling airport. Passengers filed in, unaware that several men among them carried a deadly secret beneath calm smiles and ordinary clothes. They were not travelers. They were hijackers, and their mission was about to turn a peaceful flight into a fight for survival. As the aircraft climbed into the sky, the mood was light. Children pressed their faces against the windows, watching clouds drift by like mountains of white. Businessmen typed on laptops, flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, and the pilots, veterans with decades of experience, spoke casually to air traffic control. Everything was routine, until one of the attendants noticed a man pacing near the lavatory, eyes darting nervously. She approached politely, asking if he needed assistance, but his answer came not in words, but in motion. He lunged. In one swift, violent moment the nightmare began. Within seconds, shouts erupted. Passengers screamed as two more men stood up, brandishing concealed knives and a small firearm smuggled past security. "Stay seated," one shouted in broken English, his voice trembling with adrenaline. The calm cabin became chaos. The hijackers moved with precision. They knew exactly where to go. Their leader, tall, cold-eyed, made straight for the cockpit door. Inside, the pilots had no time to react before the door burst open. "What's happening?" the captain shouted, but the hijacker pressed the gun to his head, ordering him to turn the aircraft toward an unknown destination. The co-pilot's hand hovered over the distress code switch, but one of the men caught the movement and struck him hard, knocking the transmitter out of reach. Blood trickled down the side of his face as he tried to reason with them. "There are families back there," he pleaded. "You don't have to do this." The hijacker's response was a chilling whisper. "We're already dead." Those words hung in the air, heavy and final. Back in the cabin, passengers sat frozen, clutching armrests and each other. A mother whispered prayers into her child's ear, while a man in the last row, an off-duty police officer, took quiet stock of the situation, counting how many hijackers there were and where they stood. In the control tower hundreds of miles away, controllers noticed something strange. Flight 417 had deviated from its assigned path. They radioed the crew, but there was no response, only silence. Then, a faint static crackled through, followed by an unfamiliar voice speaking erratically. The tower recognized immediately that the plane was under duress. Alarms began to ring, and emergency protocols were initiated. Military authorities were alerted. Fighter jets scrambled to shadow the flight as it veered off course toward open ocean. Inside the aircraft, fear had thickened the air. The leader of the hijackers demanded access to the flight navigation system, shouting orders at the captain to divert to an island where their associates were waiting. But what the hijackers didn't know was that one of the attendants had managed to slip into a service compartment and activate a silent transponder signal, a distress beacon that told the world exactly what was happening at 35,000 feet. Minutes turned into hours, tension stretching thin like a wire ready to snap. The hijackers took turns watching the passengers, their paranoia growing with each passing moment. In the cockpit, the captain was biding time, speaking calmly, pretending to cooperate while subtly manipulating the autopilot to slow their approach. He knew the longer they stayed airborne, the greater the chance that help could intercept them. The co-pilot, though injured, met his captain's eyes, understanding the unspoken plan. They would never let this plane be used as a weapon. But down in the cabin, something else was brewing. A group of passengers, led by the off-duty officer and a retired soldier, began quietly coordinating. Using subtle gestures and whispers, they formed a plan of their own. They would wait for the right moment, a distraction, a slip, a flicker of opportunity, and they would fight back. Then came the moment. One of the hijackers demanded to move a passenger forward as leverage, and as he turned his back, chaos erupted. The off-duty officer lunged from his seat, tackling the nearest hijacker. A struggle broke out, screams filled the cabin, and in the cockpit, the hijacker guarding the pilots turned, distracted by the noise. That was all the captain needed. In one swift move, he slammed the yoke forward, sending the plane into a sudden dive. Gravity tore through the cabin. People screamed as drinks, luggage, and bodies flew against the ceiling. The hijackers lost their balance, weapons sliding out of reach. Passengers seized their chance. The soldier grabbed the leader, forcing him down while others pinned the rest against the floor. The captain pulled back on the controls, leveling the aircraft again, the engines roaring as if angry at what the sky had just witnessed. Blood, sweat, and fear mixed into one blur of motion. By the time the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but trembling, the cabin was a battlefield. "This is your captain," he said. "We have control of the aircraft." Cheers erupted, then sobs, relief and disbelief blending into one sound that no one could describe. The off-duty officer, his arm cut and bleeding, helped tie the hijackers with seatbelts and cords. Flight attendants tended to the wounded as the captain made a sharp turn toward the nearest airbase, his hands steady, his voice clear. "We're bringing her home," he said to his co-pilot, who smiled weakly, still pressing gauze to his wound. Outside, fighter jets appeared alongside the aircraft, their sleek silhouettes a silent promise of safety. When the plane finally touched down, emergency vehicles raced alongside it, sirens wailing. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows, tears streaming down as the landing gear screeched against the tarmac. The aircraft came to a stop, surrounded instantly by armed response teams. The hijackers were dragged off the plane, their eyes wild and defeated. Inside, the passengers sat in stunned silence. Some clapped softly, others simply cried. A few whispered prayers of thanks. The captain exited the cockpit, face pale but composed, and stood before them. "You were brave," he said quietly. "You all brought this flight home." In the days that followed, news of the incident spread across the globe. The footage of the passengers being escorted from the aircraft made headlines worldwide. Experts called it one of the most extraordinary displays of civilian courage in modern aviation. Psychologists studied how ordinary people, trapped in fear, could rise together against the odds. And for those who had been on board, it became more than a story. It became a memory they would carry forever, a reminder of how fragile and yet how strong the human spirit could be when faced with pure terror. The captain retired soon after, unable to shake the memory of those tense hours. Yet he often said, in interviews and in quiet moments, that he had seen the best of humanity that day, not the worst. Years later, at a memorial ceremony honoring acts of in-flight heroism, survivors gathered again, older now but forever bonded by that day. The off-duty officer stood beside the retired captain, both silent as they watched a tribute video showing the aircraft's return. The crowd applauded, but neither of them smiled. They knew applause could never capture what it truly felt like to be suspended between life and death, fighting to breathe inside a steel cage above the clouds. The captain turned to the officer and said softly, "We weren't supposed to make it." The officer nodded. "That's why we did." Their eyes met, and for the first time, they both let themselves feel it, the miracle that courage, even when born from fear, could save the world. And so, Flight 417 became more than a headline. It became a legend of survival. A story passed down in training manuals, documentaries, and whispered tales among flight crews everywhere. It was proof that even when evil boards a plane, humanity still flies higher. Because courage isn't found in perfect moments, it's found in chaos, in screams, in the hands that reach out when the world begins to fall. The morning of Flight 417 began like any other. The airport buzzed with routine, 1,000 lives intersecting under fluorescent lights and tired voices. Flight attendants smiled as they greeted passengers boarding for a long-haul flight across the Atlantic. The pilots, Captain Richard Hale and First Officer Daniel Crowe, both veterans of countless flights, performed their pre-flight checks with the calm precision that only experience could bring. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, that familiar scent of travel that meant adventure for some and business for others. No one could have guessed that by the end of the day, this ordinary flight would become one of the most terrifying stories in aviation history. Among the passengers, seated quietly and unnoticed, were 4 men who never intended to land where everyone else did. Their eyes betrayed nothing, but their mission was clear. They were there to take control of the sky. The aircraft lifted gracefully from the runway, engines roaring as it pierced the morning clouds, climbing toward cruising altitude. Inside, passengers settled into routine comfort, headphones on, seatbelts unfastened, small talk rising above the hum of the engines. Flight attendants wheeled carts down the aisles, pouring orange juice and coffee, laughing softly with passengers. The captain made a calm announcement over the intercom, his voice confident, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." No one could have known those words would soon echo in their memories like a ghostly promise, calm before the storm. At first, it was small things that drew suspicion. A passenger near the rear noticed one man adjusting something under his jacket. Another attendant noticed 2 of the supposed travelers exchanging quick glances too often, whispering in a language she couldn't quite recognize. Still, in the rhythm of air travel, such moments were brushed aside. People were tired, anxious, or distracted. The world was full of nervous flyers. But as the plane glided smoothly through a sea of white clouds, one of the attendants, Claire Jennings, caught something strange. A man was pacing near the restroom door, sweat glistening on his forehead though the cabin was cool. When she approached to ask if he was all right, he looked at her with eyes so sharp they froze her mid-sentence. "Go back," he said in a low, hard tone. She hesitated, then turned, forcing a smile as she retreated down the aisle, heart hammering in her chest. Something inside her whispered that something terrible was about to happen. Minutes later, it began. The sound that came next would haunt everyone aboard for the rest of their lives, the sharp, metallic click of a gun being cocked. Panic spread instantly as the man in the aisle raised his weapon, shouting in broken English for everyone to stay seated. Passengers gasped, screams erupted, and chaos replaced the hum of calm conversation. 2 other men stood up from their seats near the front, pulling out knives fashioned from sharpened metal pieces hidden inside belts and shoes. The 4th, the leader, tall and expressionless, moved toward the cockpit. He banged on the door violently. "Open! Now!" he screamed. Inside, Captain Hale and First Officer Crowe exchanged horrified glances. The captain reached for the intercom to alert the cabin crew, but before he could, the cockpit door shuddered under another violent blow. Hale's voice was tight as he radioed air traffic control. "Mayday, possible hijacking situation aboard Flight 417. Static filled the line as he spoke, and seconds later, the door burst open. The lead hijacker shoved a gun into the cockpit, forcing the pilots back. "Change course!" he shouted, pointing to a set of coordinates scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. The co-pilot tried to reason with him. "You'll kill us all if you do that." But the man struck him across the face, blood splattering against the controls. The captain lifted his hand slowly, voice trembling but calm. "We'll do what you ask. Just stay calm." Back in the cabin, the scene was pandemonium. Children cried, passengers ducked in their seats, and attendants froze in place, eyes darting between the gunmen and the terrified faces of those they were sworn to protect. Claire knelt beside an elderly woman clutching her chest, whispering reassurance she didn't feel herself. A man tried to stand up, shouting in anger, but one of the hijackers kicked him hard in the ribs, forcing him down. The air had turned electric with fear, thick enough to choke on. In the control tower hundreds of miles away, a sudden silence from Flight 417 triggered alarms. Controllers tried to make contact, but the only response was static. Then a distorted voice that didn't belong to the captain. "This plane has been taken," the hijacker's voice said over the frequency, chilling and deliberate. Within minutes, the Federal Aviation Administration declared a state of emergency. Fighter jets were scrambled, and every communication line between ground and air filled with urgent chatter. Families waiting for loved ones at the destination airport received no updates, only the haunting words that the flight was experiencing an emergency. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hale tried to maintain control. The hijacker ordered him to divert toward an airfield in a remote coastal region, far off the flight plan. "We'll never make it with this fuel," Hale said truthfully, hoping to stall. The hijacker didn't care. "Then you will crash with us," he hissed. The co-pilot, bleeding from a cut near his eye, glanced sideways at his captain. They both knew they had to keep the plane stable. Panic or a wrong move could doom everyone aboard. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, a quiet plan was forming. Among those seated mid-row was an off-duty police officer named Mark Jensen and a retired Army medic named Sarah Miller. They caught each other's eyes, reading the same thought: if they didn't act, no one would survive. Mark studied the hijackers carefully, noting their positions. One near the cockpit, one in the aisle, one at the back. The leader was inside the flight deck. 3 men, 1 gun, and improvised knives. He leaned toward Sarah, whispering, "We'll need a distraction." She nodded subtly. Around them, passengers sat trembling, clutching hands and whispering prayers. The hum of the engines continued, eerily steady beneath the rising heartbeat of the crisis. Hours passed like slow-moving nightmares, with the hijackers growing increasingly agitated. They barked orders, demanded cooperation, and forced attendants to pass notes to the cockpit with instructions. What they didn't realize was that Captain Hale was sending coded responses back. Brief phrases of reassurance and position updates to anyone who could read them. He was buying time, and he knew it wouldn't last forever. By now, the control tower had fully confirmed the hijacking. On the ground, tactical teams assembled. Negotiators prepared, families gathered, and television stations broke into live coverage. But in the air, time was running short. The plane had turned toward open ocean. The hijackers grew nervous, their leader shouting for updates from the cockpit. That was when something unexpected happened. One of the younger hijackers began to panic. "We shouldn't do this," he muttered in his native language, shaking. The leader struck him hard across the face. "We die together," he said coldly. The others fell silent. That single sentence revealed their plan to everyone within earshot. They had no intention of surviving. That realization changed everything. Fear turned into resolve. Survival depended on action. Back in row 22, Mark Jensen whispered to the few passengers around him, "If they plan to die, we have nothing to lose." His voice was steady, though his heart was racing. "When the moment comes, we fight." A ripple of courage passed through the terrified crowd. People nodded, some crying silently, others gripping seat belts as makeshift restraints. Sarah Miller quietly armed herself with a broken wine bottle from the galley, her hands shaking but her eyes sharp. The tension in that cabin was like static before lightning, waiting for the first spark. Up front, Captain Hale glanced at his co-pilot. "We won't make it to that airstrip," he whispered. "We'll have to take control." The co-pilot, pale and exhausted, nodded. The 2 men exchanged one last look of silent understanding, the kind only people who have faced death together could share. Hale slowly reached toward the emergency code switch again, hidden beneath his seat, careful not to draw attention. The hijacker inside the cockpit noticed the movement and shouted, swinging his gun toward the captain. But at that exact moment, a scream echoed from the cabin behind them. One of the passengers had lunged at the hijacker guarding the aisle. The fight had begun. The cockpit filled with chaos once more, the aircraft jerking violently as the captain fought to regain control. The hijacker stumbled, distracted by the sound of fighting behind the door. The co-pilot took his chance, ramming the man with his shoulder, sending the weapon flying. The gun clattered to the floor, the struggle spilling into shouts and crashes. The plane suddenly dropped altitude, loose items flying, passengers screaming. "Hold on!" the captain shouted as alarms blared. He pulled the yoke, leveling the jet as best he could. Behind the locked door, the passengers were fighting for their lives, courage battling terror in the narrow aisles of a skybound prison. As the sun began to set outside the cabin windows, the entire world held its breath. News stations broadcast live coverage, fighter jets shadowed the aircraft, and everyone on the ground waited for a single message: that someone had survived. But up in the thin air of 35,000 feet, the battle was far from over, and every heartbeat on that plane echoed like thunder in the sky. The inside of Flight 417 had turned into a battlefield suspended in the sky, a place where fear and courage were now indistinguishable from each other. The once calm cabin was now filled with the sound of chaos, shouts, groans, and the metallic rattle of the aircraft struggling to stay steady. Passengers had broken free from the paralysis of terror. The quiet prayers that had filled the cabin only an hour earlier were replaced with the sharp, desperate sounds of survival. Mark Jensen, the off-duty police officer, was at the center of it all, wrestling one of the hijackers near the forward galley. The man was taller, stronger, fueled by adrenaline and rage, but Mark had something the hijacker didn't: training, and the determination not to let innocent people die that day. Every blow landed with purpose. Around them, passengers were screaming, ducking under seats, clutching children. The air smelled like sweat, fear, and jet fuel. Overhead bins hung open, luggage scattered across the floor. It was no longer a flight, it was a war zone in the sky. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Hale fought to maintain control of the plane as the chaos behind him reached a fever pitch. He could hear every muffled scream, every impact, every cry. The hijacker who had burst into the cockpit earlier was sprawled on the floor, unconscious after the co-pilot, Daniel Crow, had slammed his head into the side panel. Blood streaked the controls, but both pilots were too focused to care. The captain wiped his hands on his sleeve, muttering, "We're losing altitude." Warning alarms blared as the plane dipped through thin clouds. He reached for the throttle, steadying it with precision learned from years of experience. "We've got to get this thing back under control," he said through gritted teeth. Daniel adjusted switches, rerouting the electrical system, the cockpit a symphony of beeping warnings and flashing red lights. "We can't land like this," Daniel said. "We'll tear apart if we try." The captain glanced at him. "Then we'll hold this bird together until we can." In the cabin, passengers were fighting back with everything they had. The hijackers were losing control, their plan unraveling in the face of sheer human resistance. Sarah Miller, the retired Army medic, had been pinned to the ground moments ago but now crawled to her feet, gripping the broken wine bottle she'd kept hidden. She swung it with everything she had, striking one of the attackers across the shoulder. He roared in pain, swinging his arm wildly, but she ducked under him and drove the jagged glass into his thigh. The man screamed, collapsing against the seat. Another passenger, a middle-aged father who had been silent until now, threw himself onto the hijacker's back, helping hold him down. The sight of one person fighting gave courage to others. Soon it wasn't just a few, it was the entire cabin. Strangers shouted encouragement to one another. "Hold him down," someone yelled. "Don't let go." For the first time since the hijacking began, the power shifted. The hijackers had underestimated their victims. Fear had turned into fury, desperation into unity. The leader, still in the cockpit doorway, turned and saw his plan crumbling. He shouted orders to his remaining men in a panicked voice, but no one could hear him over the roar of the engines and the chaos inside the cabin. Mark Jensen had managed to wrestle the weapon away from his opponent. He pointed the gun toward the leader but hesitated. The plane jolted violently, sending both men crashing against the bulkhead. The gun slid down the aisle, stopping near a row of terrified passengers. One of them, a teenage boy traveling alone, picked it up with trembling hands, staring at it as though it were a snake. Mark shouted, "Throw it here!" The boy did, and Mark caught it, breathing heavily as he pointed it back at the remaining hijacker. "Get on the ground!" he yelled, voice cracking with adrenaline. The hijacker didn't obey. He lunged. A single shot rang out. The deafening sound filled the narrow cabin, echoing against metal walls. Then came silence, just for a moment, as everyone froze. The hijacker fell to the floor, motionless. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. A child started crying. Somewhere, a woman whispered a prayer of thanks through tears. Mark lowered the gun, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "It's over," someone whispered, but it wasn't. Not yet. In the cockpit, Captain Hale heard the shot and flinched. "What the hell was that?" he asked. Daniel checked the intercom, which had been damaged during the earlier fight. "We're not sure what's going on back there," he said. "But we've got another problem: fuel imbalance." One of the hijackers, before being overpowered, had tampered with the aircraft's fuel system, rerouting flow between tanks. It wasn't enough to bring the plane down immediately, but it was creating uneven weight distribution. The plane was drifting slightly to the left, the autopilot struggling to compensate. Hale switched to manual control, his hands gripping the yoke tightly. "They wanted this plane to crash one way or another," he muttered. Daniel nodded grimly. "We're not going to give them that satisfaction." On the ground, radar controllers were tracking every move. Fighter jets now flew alongside Flight 417, maintaining visual contact. The pilots inside those jets could see flashes of movement through the cabin windows, shadows of people fighting, smoke rising. They reported to command that the passengers appeared to be regaining control, but the aircraft was still unstable. Inside the tower, tension was unbearable. Families of passengers were gathered in waiting areas, watching live footage of the aircraft surrounded by military escorts. No one spoke. Every pair of eyes was glued to the television screens. Back in the cabin, the passengers were now exhausted, covered in bruises and tears. The last hijacker was finally restrained by a group of men using belts and headphone cords as makeshift ties. Blood stained the aisle carpet, and overhead, the lights flickered. Sarah Miller moved from seat to seat, tending to the wounded with what little supplies she had: bandages torn from shirts, oxygen masks ripped from panels. Her voice was calm, steady, maternal, even as her own hands shook. "You're okay," she whispered to a young mother cradling her crying child. "You're going to make it. We're all going to make it." Then came the captain's voice over the intercom, raspy but calm. "This is your captain speaking. The situation is under control. I need everyone to stay seated and stay calm. We're making an emergency landing." The words brought relief, but also new fear. The aircraft was still high above the ocean, and there was no nearby runway long enough to take them. The only option was an emergency descent toward a coastal military base that had been hastily cleared for their arrival. The passengers sat in silence now, gripping armrests, holding hands. The hum of the engines was the only sound, steady and haunting. The co-pilot coordinated with air traffic control, his voice calm but fast. "We're low on fuel and dealing with system damage. Requesting immediate priority for landing." The tower's response came quick. "Runway 4 is clear. Fire and rescue are standing by. You're cleared to land." Daniel relayed the message to Hale, who nodded. "Let's bring them home," he said quietly. As the aircraft began its descent, the cabin tilted downward, pressure shifting, oxygen masks swinging overhead. The sunset outside bathed the cabin in a surreal orange glow, painting the terrified faces in light that looked almost peaceful. The passengers braced, the crew secured the aisles, and the captain focused on the single most important task of his life: getting that plane safely onto the ground. The sound of wind against the fuselage grew louder, faster, until it drowned out every other noise. In those final minutes before landing, there was a strange calm, a collective silence shared by everyone aboard. They had been strangers at the beginning of the day, but now they were something else entirely. Survivors, fighters, witnesses to both evil and courage. As the runway lights appeared through the windshield, the captain tightened his grip on the controls and whispered to himself, "Not today." The wheels hit the ground hard, the screech of landing gear echoing through the cabin as the plane bounced, slid, and finally slowed to a stop. The sound of silence returned, but this time, it was the silence of victory, of disbelief, of life. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft as doors opened, and light flooded inside. One by one, passengers stumbled out onto the tarmac, crying, hugging, clutching each other as if afraid to let go. The captain and his co-pilot were the last to leave the cockpit, their uniforms stained with blood and sweat, but their eyes alive. As paramedics rushed in, Sarah leaned against a seat, tears running freely down her face. Mark Jensen, his arm bandaged, looked out toward the horizon and exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The nightmare was over, but its echoes would never fade. The sky above them was calm again, but no one who had been on Flight 417 would ever look at it the same way. Night had fallen over the coastal airfield, yet the scene on the tarmac still blazed with flashing lights, shouting voices, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with smoke. Flight 417 had come to rest at the far end of the runway, its landing gear half buried in scorched asphalt. The sound of sirens echoed through the darkness, fire trucks circling, paramedics rushing from one cluster of survivors to another. The passengers, those who had fought, those who had prayed, and those who had simply sat frozen in terror, were now blank-faced, their bodies trembling from shock. Flashlights swept across the cracked fuselage, illuminating shattered windows and streaks of blood along the aisle. It was over, but for everyone standing under that cold night sky, the horror was only beginning to settle in. Captain Richard Hale stood beside the open emergency slide, watching his passengers step onto solid ground. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with soot, his hands still trembling slightly. He hadn't spoken much since the landing, only brief words to the control tower and emergency teams. The weight of command had never felt heavier. He knew that if he closed his eyes, he would still see the cockpit door bursting open, still hear the sound of a gunshot reverberating through the thin cabin walls. His co-pilot, Daniel Crow, sat a few feet away on a stretcher, his left arm bandaged and blood soaking through the gauze. Paramedics hovered nearby, asking questions he barely seemed to hear. "Are you in pain?" one asked. He gave a faint smile. "Only when I think about what could have happened." Across the tarmac, passengers huddled in silver emergency blankets, faces pale in the harsh lights of rescue vehicles. Some were being treated for bruises, others for shock, and a few for knife wounds sustained during the desperate fight. Reporters had already begun gathering beyond the security line, their cameras glinting like distant stars, capturing the faces of survivors whose lives had just changed forever. Sarah Miller, the retired Army medic, sat with a small group of passengers, still working even as tears ran down her cheek. She pressed gauze to a man's shoulder, whispering comfort. "You did good," she told him quietly. "You're alive, that's what matters." He nodded weakly, his eyes distant, his voice hoarse. "We fought back because of you." She looked away, swallowing hard. "No," she said softly, "because of all of us." Mark Jensen, the off-duty police officer, was sitting on the curb near one of the fire engines, his arm in a sling, his face pale. The weapon he had wrestled from the hijacker was now sealed inside an evidence bag, held by federal agents standing nearby. An investigator approached, clipboard in hand, asking him to recount what had happened. Mark stared at the ground for a long moment before he began. His voice was low, steady but filled with weight. They knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't here to negotiate. They wanted to die, and they wanted to take all of us with them. The agent nodded grimly, taking note. "And you stopped them." Mark's eyes flickered toward the aircraft, the dark silhouette still smoking in the night. "We all did," he said. "Everyone on that plane made a choice, to stop being afraid." Meanwhile, investigators from the Aviation Authority boarded the aircraft under heavy security. Their flashlights cut through the smoky cabin, illuminating the aftermath. Blood splattered across seatbacks, broken glass crunched under their boots, and the smell of fear still lingered in the air. One of them whispered, "It looks like a war zone." Another found the black box intact, its orange casing reflecting the beam of his flashlight. "We'll find out everything," he muttered. But even as they worked, they knew the true story couldn't be captured by data alone. The recordings would show only the mechanical truth: altitude, speed, alarms, but they could never capture the sound of human courage in that final descent. As dawn approached, survivors were transported to a nearby facility for debriefing. The room was quiet except for the occasional sob. The walls were pale, the fluorescent lights too bright. Officials moved between tables, gathering statements, offering water and blankets. Captain Hale sat with his co-pilot, both staring blankly at the form in front of them. "Describe the event," it said in bold print. The captain sighed, rubbing his temple. "Where do you even start?" Daniel answered softly, "At the beginning. We took off, and life was normal." The captain looked up, eyes tired but defiant. "And we're going to make sure it stays that way for everyone else." When the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the sky gold and red, news networks across the world carried the same image: the battered aircraft resting silently against the dawn. Headlines screamed words like "Heroic passengers foil hijacking," "Miracle at 35,000 feet," "The flight that refused to die." The footage replayed endlessly. Passengers stepping down the emergency slide, paramedics running, and finally, the image of the captain saluting the ground crew before walking away from his aircraft. It became a symbol overnight, a story of unity in the face of terror. But for those who had lived it, the applause and praise felt hollow. Days later, the official investigation revealed chilling details. The hijackers had smuggled weapons onto the plane through a gap in security at the departure airport, exploiting outdated scanning technology. Their plan had been to seize control mid-flight and crash the plane into a populated city. The idea was horrifying, and yet it had been narrowly stopped by chance, by courage, by ordinary people who refused to surrender. The leader of the hijackers had died during the struggle. His final words caught faintly on the cockpit recorder: "We will be remembered." But he was wrong. The world didn't remember them. The world remembered the people who fought back. In the days that followed, media vans camped outside the survivors' hotels, seeking interviews. Some agreed to speak, their voices trembling as they described the moment everything changed. "I thought it was over," one woman said, "but then someone shouted and we all just moved. It was like instinct." Another man said quietly, "I don't know what gave me the courage. I just didn't want to die sitting down." Their words were replayed again and again, a reminder that even in terror, humanity still had light left in it. Captain Hale, however, stayed silent. He turned down interviews, refused book deals, and avoided publicity. When asked why, he said, "I did my job." The real heroes were the people behind that door. Still, letters flooded in from around the world. Children drawing airplanes with smiling faces, families thanking him for proving that bravery still existed in the modern world. He read every single one, quietly, often late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Sometimes, when the memories grew too heavy, he would step outside and stare at the stars. The same sky he had once feared might be his grave. Weeks later, a memorial ceremony was held on the same airfield where the plane had landed. Survivors stood together again, the faint sound of wind brushing over the tarmac. Some were reunited with the crew for the first time since that night. Tears flowed freely as the names of those injured were read aloud. The captain gave a short speech, his voice steady but emotional. "When fear came aboard that plane," he said, "it met something stronger: hope, courage, and the will to live. That's what kept us flying when everything else failed. The crowd fell silent, and even the reporters lowered their cameras. For a brief moment, the noise of the world faded, replaced by the quiet heartbeat of gratitude. As the ceremony ended, Sarah Miller walked up to the captain. "You saved us," she said softly. He shook his head. "We saved each other." She smiled faintly, tears welling in her eyes. "Then we all get to keep flying." The captain looked toward the horizon, where another jet climbed into the morning sky, sunlight glinting off its wings. "Yes," he whispered, "we do." That night, long after the news trucks had left and the survivors had returned to their homes, the airfield was silent again. Only the wind moved, brushing softly against the scarred pavement where Flight 417 had stopped. But in that silence, something powerful remained, a reminder written not in words, but in memory. That courage doesn't live in medals or ceremonies. It lives in the hearts of those who chose to stand when the world told them to kneel. And for every person who had sat aboard that plane, the sound of the engines fading into darkness would forever be replaced by something stronger, the sound of people refusing to die quietly, and choosing instead to fight for life. The world never forgot Flight 417. Months after that night, the story still filled newspapers, documentaries, and late-night discussions. For many, it had become more than an air disaster story. It was a symbol of resilience, of how ordinary people could become extraordinary when pushed to the edge. But for those who had lived through it, fame brought no comfort. Their lives had changed forever, divided into two timelines, before the flight and after the flight. No one boarded a plane the same way again. They checked faces, watched for movements, and flinched at sudden noises. What had happened inside that cabin at 35,000 feet lingered in their bones like an old wound that never fully healed. Captain Richard Hale returned home to a quiet neighborhood in Seattle, where neighbors left flowers on his porch and reporters camped outside for days. But he didn't speak to the cameras. The only people he could face were those who had been there with him. Every night, he replayed the descent in his mind, the flashing warnings, the trembling hands, the roar of the engines as he guided that crippled plane back to Earth. The nightmares came often. He would wake up gasping, his hands reaching for controls that weren't there. The therapist he saw called it survivor's guilt, but Hale thought it was something else. "It's the silence," he told her one afternoon. "When it all went quiet up there, that silence stayed with me. You don't just hear it, you feel it. It gets inside you." His co-pilot, Daniel Crow, spent weeks in recovery for his injuries. The scars along his arm were minor compared to the weight he carried in his heart. The two men met often in the months that followed, sitting in a small coffee shop near the docks, both wearing civilian clothes now, looking like ordinary men. Yet there was always that understanding between them, a quiet connection that didn't need words. One night, Daniel looked across the table and said, "You ever think about how it ended?" Hale nodded. "Every day." Daniel's voice lowered. "We could have died up there. All of us. But we didn't." The captain stirred his coffee, watching the ripples move across the surface. "Because people didn't freeze. They fought." Meanwhile, Sarah Miller, the retired Army medic who had tended to the wounded during the chaos, found herself becoming an unexpected figure in the public eye. She was invited on talk shows, her calm bravery replayed in documentaries, her photo printed in magazines under headlines like "The Woman Who Saved Flight 417. But she felt none of it belonged to her. Each time she spoke about the experience, her hands would shake, her eyes filling with the ghosts of that cabin. "You don't understand," she told one reporter who asked if she felt proud. "You don't feel proud when you see people bleeding and screaming for their lives. You just feel grateful they're still breathing." She eventually moved away from the city, settling in a small coastal town where the only sounds were waves and wind, quiet, steady, merciful sounds that didn't remind her of engines or screams. Mark Jensen, the off-duty police officer, became something of a legend among law enforcement circles. His calm leadership during the fight had been recorded by passengers' cell phones, Footage later released by investigators. It showed him tackling one of the hijackers, shouting for others to help, directing chaos into courage. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him, to shake his hand. But when they called him a hero, his response was always the same. "I just didn't want to die sitting down." He was invited to speak at academies, where young cadets listened to him describe what true fear felt like. "It's not panic," he would say, his voice low but firm. "It's the cold. The stillness. The moment your body realizes the world might end, and you still move anyway." The airline rebuilt its reputation, though its name was forever linked to that tragedy. The aircraft itself was dismantled, every piece studied and catalogued. The black box recordings were released to training programs around the world, used as an example of cockpit leadership and crisis control. The pilots' calm voices became iconic, played in classrooms, their composure dissected by experts who tried to teach others how to do what instinct and humanity had done that day. One particular recording, the moment the captain said, "We're bringing her home," became the line most remembered. It wasn't just aviation history, it became a mantra for anyone facing the impossible. But not all wounds could be seen on camera or in reports. Many passengers struggled long after the rescue. Some refused to fly again. Others developed severe anxiety, unable to enter crowded places or sleep without nightmares. Support groups formed online, gatherings of survivors who met once a month to talk, to cry, and to remind each other they were still here. Sarah attended once, listening quietly before standing up to speak. "We fought for our lives together," she said softly. "We weren't soldiers. We weren't trained. But we refused to be victims. That's what saved us. That's what I want to remember, not the fear, but the moment we chose to stand up." The room went silent. People nodded, some crying, some smiling for the first time in months. Captain Hale avoided those meetings for a long time. He felt his presence might reopen wounds. But one day, he walked in quietly, unannounced. When people saw him, the room erupted into applause. He raised his hand to stop them, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "You don't owe me applause," he said. "You owe yourselves credit. You're the ones who made it possible for me to land that plane. Without your courage, there would have been nothing left to save." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "That day I didn't see passengers. I saw warriors. And I'll never forget that." Years passed, but the legacy of Flight 417 only grew stronger. A small memorial was built near the coastal airfield where the plane had landed, a single piece of its fuselage mounted upright, engraved with the names of everyone on board. The plaque below read, "At 35,000 feet, fear met courage, and courage won." Every year on the anniversary, survivors gathered there to light candles, to touch the cold metal, and to remember the silence that had nearly swallowed them. Children who had once been passengers came back as adults, some with families of their own. They brought flowers and told their kids stories not of terror, but of bravery. At one such memorial, Mark Jensen stood with Sarah and Captain Hale. The three hadn't seen each other in years, but time hadn't erased their bond. They shared quiet smiles, memories unspoken but alive between them. As the sun set over the ocean, Hale looked at the memorial and said softly, "You know, when we were up there, I thought the sky was going to be our grave. But now, when I look up, I think of it as home." Sarah nodded, eyes glistening. "We left part of ourselves up there," she whispered. Mark added, "And maybe that's why we still look at it with respect, not fear anymore." When the last candle was lit, the crowd fell silent, heads bowed. The sound of distant waves filled the air. For a brief moment it was as though time itself had paused, the chaos, the noise, the world below, all gone. Only the memory remained. The memory of courage at 35,000 feet. In the years that followed, the story of Flight 417 became part of aviation training across the globe. Pilots studied it. Crews remembered it. Passengers still whispered it to one another on long flights. It became a story not about death, but about life, a reminder that even in the cold, mechanical world of flight, humanity still mattered most. Captain Hale never flew commercially again. Instead, he became an instructor, teaching young pilots how to stay calm when the sky turned against them. His lessons always ended the same way. When things fall apart, your job isn't to be fearless, it's to be steady. Fear will always be there, but courage is choosing to fly through it. He spent his final years quietly, often visiting the coast, watching planes lift off and disappear into the horizon. Each time he heard the distant roar of engines, he felt peace. The world had moved on, but Flight 417 had left behind something indestructible, a story of people who faced death and instead found unity, sacrifice, and hope. And in that story, the sky itself became not a place of fear, but a promise that even when darkness rises, humanity still knows how to fight back and find its way home. Years passed, and the world moved on from Flight 417's headlines, but for those who had lived through that terrible, beautiful night, time didn't erase anything, it only softened the edges. The incident became history, then legend, then something larger, a symbol of defiance in the face of terror. Aviation documentaries called it the flight that fought back. Historians studied it, teachers used it to inspire courage, and every year, as the anniversary drew near, the story found new life across screens and hearts. But for Captain Richard Hale, the man who had once guided 200 souls through the sky with blood on his hands and fire in his lungs, the memory was not a story. It was a pulse that never stopped. He had retired now, his hair silver, his eyes still as sharp as the day he wore his captain's uniform. He lived quietly in a small lakeside home north of Seattle, far from the chaos of the world, far from airports and towers and runways. Each morning, he walked to the water's edge with a cup of coffee and watched the planes flying overhead, tiny, glinting dots in the pale blue. He always wondered who was up there, a nervous traveler clutching an armrest, a child pressing their face against the window, a pilot steady at the controls. He hoped, whoever they were, they flew without fear. But even after all those years, when the wind blew just right, he could still hear it, the silence of the engines, the muffled screams, the sound of courage rising in the dark. One autumn afternoon, he received a letter. It came in a simple white envelope, postmarked from New York. The handwriting was neat but uncertain. When he opened it, he found a short note and a photograph. The note read, "You don't know me, Captain Hale, but my mother was on Flight 417. She told me how you stayed calm when everyone else was breaking apart. She said you taught her that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite it. She passed away last year, but she never forgot you. Thank you for bringing her home." The photograph showed a young woman and her mother standing at an airport, smiling, sunlight spilling over their faces. Hale set the letter down, his hands trembling. The world had long since moved on from his story, but in that moment, he realized it still lived quietly in the hearts of those he had saved. The airline later contacted him to speak at an aviation safety conference. At first, he refused. He had sworn never to relive it in public again. But after reading that letter, something inside him stirred. He agreed, not as a hero, but as a witness. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Pilots, engineers, and young cadets filled the seats, eager to hear the man behind the myth. Hale spoke softly, without theatric. "When you lose control of a plane," he said, "you also lose control of time. Seconds stretch into eternity. But you never stop thinking. You never stop trying. The passengers behind you, they aren't strangers anymore. They're lives you've been entrusted with. And in that moment, nothing matters except bringing them home." His voice broke slightly. That night, the people on Flight 417 didn't panic. They didn't surrender. They fought for one another. That's what flying really is, trust, not technology. Faith, not fear. When he finished, the entire hall stood in silence before breaking into thunderous applause. But Hale simply bowed his head, humbled, his eyes glistening. After that day, he began receiving letters from across the world. Pilots wrote to say his words changed how they saw their duty. Survivors of other crashes thanked him for giving them hope. Parents told him their children wanted to be pilots because of him. It was overwhelming at first, but slowly, Hale learned to accept what he had spent years avoiding, the truth that the story wasn't his burden anymore. It belonged to everyone who heard it and found strength in it. Sarah Miller, now in her late 60s, continued to volunteer as a trauma counselor for airline crews. She often told new attendants about that night, not to frighten them, but to show them the power of humanity in chaos. "You'll never know what you're capable of until the world starts falling apart," she'd say with a small smile. "And when it does, you'll be surprised by what your heart can do." Mark Jensen, the off-duty officer who had fought in the aisle that night, had risen to a senior position in law enforcement. Every year on the anniversary of the hijacking, he sent Hale a message, short, simple, and always the same. "Still flying, Captain." On the 10th anniversary, the survivors gathered at the Coastal Memorial once more. The ocean was calm that evening, the same endless horizon that had once looked like death now glowing with sunset gold. Families of the passengers stood with flowers, while reporters stayed respectfully distant. The memorial plaque had been polished, its words catching the light. At 35,000 feet, courage took flight. Hale stood before it with Sarah and Mark beside him, the three of them older now, faces lined with time but eyes still holding the fire of that night. Children ran nearby. Some of them were babies during the flight, too young to remember, yet living proof of what had been saved. When the crowd quieted, Hale stepped forward to speak. His voice was low, steady, touched by emotion. "When I close my eyes, I still see that night. I see faces filled with fear, and I see hands reaching for one another. I see people who refused to die as victims. And every time I look at the sky, I remember that humanity didn't fall that day, it rose." The wind brushed through his gray hair as he paused. "We were just people. We weren't soldiers or heroes. But in that moment we became a family. And because of that, we lived." Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. Mark put a hand on Hale's shoulder. Around them, the crowd stood silent, many crying openly, the only sound the ocean's slow heartbeat against the shore. After the ceremony, as dusk turned to night, Hale lingered at the memorial. The others had gone, leaving candles flickering in the wind. He placed his hand on the cold metal of the fuselage piece and whispered, "We did it. We brought her home." Then he looked up at the sky. A plane passed overhead, its lights blinking against the stars. He followed its path until it disappeared into the darkness, and for the first time in years, the memory of that silence didn't haunt him, it comforted him. Because it wasn't the silence of death anymore. It was the silence of peace. In his final years, Captain Hale wrote a memoir, though he never sought to publish it. He called it The Sky That Remembered Us. It wasn't about airplanes or procedures, it was about people. About the courage that exists in quiet places, in strangers, in moments when the world stops turning. When he passed away peacefully one winter morning, the aviation community around the world mourned. Pilots everywhere observed a minute of radio silence at 35,000 feet. For 60 long seconds, no one spoke. Only the steady hum of engines filled the air, a tribute to the man who had once guided his plane through the same silence and brought everyone home. Today, at flight schools across the world, his words are still taught. In simulators, young pilots learn about Flight 417, not just as a technical case, but as a lesson in humanity. They hear the calm voice from that recording saying, "We're bringing her home." And even though the sky is vast and time has carried the story into history, every time a jet cuts through the clouds, a small piece of that courage lives on inside it. Because Flight 417 was never just about hijackers or tragedy, it was about the unbreakable thread that binds people together when everything else falls apart. It was about passengers who became warriors, a crew who refused to surrender, and a captain who taught the world that even at 35,000 feet, when terror takes the sky, the human spirit can still rise higher. And so, when you look up and see a plane glowing against the night, remember this: inside it are people who trust one another, who fly because others once fought to make the sky safe again. That is the legacy of Flight 417, the flight that refused to die, the flight that reminded humanity that no darkness, no fear, and no silence is ever stronger than our will to survive. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the courage that lives in all of us, remember to subscribe to the channel. Here, we honor the real stories of humanity, the stories that remind us that even when the engines fail, the heart still knows how to fly.